Please be seated. Good morning. I'm Lisa Mazer from the Department of the Air Force, and today's lecture is the fourth in the Commandant's Lecture Series on ethics. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you a leading voice in accountability for ethical government, Ms. Danielle Bryan. Ms. Bryan is the Executive Director of the Project on Government Oversight, a nonprofit government watchdog organization that champions investigations into corruption, misconduct, and conflicts of interest to achieve a more effective, accountable, open, and ethical federal government. She frequently testifies before Congress and regularly appears in major national media for investigations into areas such as cutting wasteful spending and exposing corruption by government contractors, increasing whistleblower protections for the intelligence community, and fighting excessive government secrecy and overclassification of information. Ms. Bryan was inducted into the Freedom of Information Act Hall of Fame and was ranked by Ethisphere magazine as one of the top 100 most influential people in business ethics. Ms. Bryan serves on the Board of Taxpayers for Common Sense and is the chair of the steering committee for openthegovernment.org. She received her undergraduate degree in government from Smith's College and her master's in international relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Please welcome Ms. Danielle Bryan.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you so much for inviting me here. A special thanks to General Brown, Professor Foster, and Ms. Mazer for your wonderful and warm welcome this morning. It's an honor to be asked to speak before you here today. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to enter into the discourse envisioned by President Eisenhower during the laying of the cornerstone of this hall. You probably have heard this before, but I want to repeat it. At that time, he said, "Our liberties rest with our people upon the scope and depth of their understanding of the nation's spiritual, political, military, and economic realities." My talk today raises the question of whether our expectations for ethical behavior, government accountability, and oversight are in fact at odds with those realities. And if they are, what does that mean? A few years back, HBO made a movie based on the book The Pentagon Wars by Colonel Jim Burton. He'd been assigned to oversee the testing of several new weapons in development in the early 1980s and became concerned about the unnecessary danger to troops riding in the early versions of the Bradley fighting vehicle. The ammunition was originally being stored inside the lightweight aluminum hull, along with the troops being transported in the vehicle. The problem was that aluminum burns and melts at high temperatures, and Burton knew what that would mean for the troops if the Bradley was subject to enemy fire. As a result, he refused to sign off on the design without subjecting the Bradley to live fire testing. But in order to keep the program on track, contractor personnel and uniformed officers falsified the tests, including filling the gas tanks with water, filling the ammunition with sand in order to prevent them from exploding during those tests. As the movie and book painfully detail, the Pentagon blasted everything in their power, including literally transferring Burton to Alaska to stop him. Why? Because Burton's demand for live fire testing of the Bradley prototypes was inconveniencing the program. Kelsey Grammer brilliantly portrayed a general who was more concerned about his next star and his future career in the private sector, which might be threatened by a delay in the program, than in the safety for the troops. The film used comedy to help the viewer understand what was an absurd situation, but in fact accurately depicted the events. Colonel Burton actually worked on the film to make sure that nothing as absurd as it seemed was actually inaccurate. In the story, the political, military, and economic realities that President Eisenhower spoke of were personal advancement, bureaucratic self-preservation, and profit motives. And they were directly at odds with duty, honor, country, ethics, and accountability. Because of his tenacity in the face of those realities, and because of his bravery under bureaucratic fire, Colonel Burton has as a legacy the live fire testing that led the Bradley to being retrofitted with reactive armor and the ammunition being moved to outside the vehicle. At the end of the story, the question you ask, though, is, why did he have to fight so hard just to make sure our troops weren't unnecessarily put in harm's way? Colonel Burton was part of a larger group known as the Pentagon Underground, a cadre of uniformed and civilian personnel who were deeply concerned about wasted taxpayer dollars and falsified weapons testing. They saw themselves as closet patriots who believed it was their duty to fight what they saw as the problem of more bucks and less bang. They were determined to fight the practice of putting bureaucratic and corporate interests ahead of the interests of the troops and the taxpayers. And they certainly never thought of themselves as whistleblowers, but simply as people who were not going to allow the realities of life in the Pentagon weaken their ethical standards. My organization, the Project on Government Oversight, also known as POGO, was created 30 years ago because there was a need for an organizational home for the Pentagon Underground, those insiders who wanted to fix problems without having to suffer the kind of retaliation that Colonel Burton endured. These insiders helped our organization, which was then called the Project on Military Procurement, I interned there, to expose the infamous $7,600 coffee pot, the $436 hammer, the $640 toilet seat. Together, we also helped to expose the failures of the Sergeant York Divad gun and championed bureaucratically unpopular but fabulously successful programs such as the A-10 Warthog. And together, we were instrumental in helping to create the Pentagon's Office of Operational Test and Evaluation. The idea behind our group was that the most effective oversight begins from the inside. And that idea has not changed. Bad news is rarely offered up for scrutiny by an institution itself. As a result, it typically takes brave insiders with access to that information to bring uncomfortable truths to light. And only by revealing uncomfortable truths, those important truths that do not appear in annual reports or even in congressional testimony because they're embarrassing, not because they don't matter. Only then can problems be fixed before they turn into disasters or an institution be held accountable when the disaster occurs. Now let me be clear, I'm not using the word disaster lightly. In the world of national security, the impact of wrongdoing can be profound. And being willing to challenge misbehavior is not being a tattletale or a snitch. It's being willing to do your duty to your country regardless of personal consequence. For example, you may remember the case of the Kabul embassy security contractors having drunken naked parties in front of Afghan citizens a couple of years ago. As many as 20 whistleblowers from Camp Sullivan came to POGO forward with information of evidence of a blatant and long-standing violation of the security contract, a pervasive breakdown in the chain of command, and guard force discipline and morale. Of course, the media picked up on the men in grass skirts who were urinating on each other. But what mattered far more was the chronic understaffing of the guard force, the hiring of guards who didn't speak English, and the total breakdown in command structure, in part because some of the guard force senior officers were engaged in the partying. All this risked compromising security at the embassy. And when the story hit the news, the focus at Camp Sullivan became figuring out who had exposed the problems. And one of the whistleblowers was met with a threatening poster on the door to his room that said, "Rats can cost you your job and your family." This is where the realities and ethics come head to head. Truth tellers, or whistleblowers, are not embraced as heroes in most quarters, and particularly not in the military environment. That's why whistleblowers need protection from retaliation by those who feel threatened by the attack on the institution's public image. I'm using the word whistleblower in a broad sense. I suspect some of you may be thinking of a person who has gone public or who's filed a lawsuit, but I'm really not just limiting it to that kind of person. I'm talking about anyone who is brave enough to try to stop illegal or unethical behavior, whether through channels or by going public. In fact, I believe a person should always try to fix a problem by going through channels first. But experience has shown that bureaucratic channels are not typically welcoming. I expect you've heard this warning before from Admiral Rickover. If you're going to sin, sin against God and not the bureaucracy. God will forgive you, but the bureaucracy will not. This is not a partisan phenomenon. And adding to the realities that compound the problem is that there is no meaningful safe channels for disclosure. The painful irony is that people who are trying to do the right thing are actually driven to the media to expose wrongdoing because there's no effective or safe way of doing so internally, and then they get nailed for it. Currently, national security whistleblowers are more at risk of prosecution under the Espionage Act than any other time in our history. As a result, in order to lessen that tension between the realities you face and the right thing to do, we have always promoted anonymous activism. In other words, we work to document a problem, identify solutions, and advocate for a policy change, all while protecting the identity of the original source. Back in 1981, those people loosely associated with the Pentagon underground would help each other to create public pressure to fix problems without having to go public and sacrifice their jobs. Whether it was their weekly evening gatherings at the Fort Myers Officers Club, long phone calls to keep each other's spirits up, or teaching each other how to backflush a document to help protect the identity of the person who would leak it, they were there for each other. Now, from some of the blank stares that I'm getting, I should explain that last one. If you wrote a memo in your official capacity and sent it to one person, it's fairly obvious when it goes public that one of the two of you leaked it. But, however, if you copy a bunch of people throughout the building on the document about some particular wrongdoing, the source is much harder to identify and punish. I suspect I may be making some, or maybe all of you, uncomfortable with the idea that leaking documents can be a good thing. I'm only advocating this as a last resort after internal channels have not worked. I mentioned above that the best oversight begins from the inside, but the other half of that equation is that often oversight also requires pressure from the outside. And usually, to successfully stop wrongdoing, it requires documentation that proves the misconduct is happening. I am not talking about indiscriminate leaking, for example, in the Bradley Manning case. I definitely am not recommending or defending that. I'm talking about specific documentation of wrongdoing. Anyway, now, each individual whistleblower is isolated, and this brotherhood barely exists. Why do you think that is? Is there no more wrongdoing or wastefulness to stop? Or is it clear that the system is not designed to work? And almost never, and I really mean never, does the person who tells the truth survive in his career? Let's explore this concept a little bit. I realize all of you are well-versed in ethical matters, but I ask that you indulge me while I break down what might seem obvious to explore this dichotomy between what's on paper and what's reality. Here are some codes of ethics that you're probably familiar with. The Navy. Place loyalty to the Constitution, laws, and ethical principles above private gain, and disclose fraud, waste, and abuse and corruption to appropriate authorities in its code of ethics. West Point explains the purpose of its honor code as follows. In professions such as the military, where life is endangered by virtue of the institution's purpose, trust becomes sacred and integrity becomes a requisite quality for each professional. An officer who is not trustworthy cannot be tolerated. In some professions, the cost of dishonesty is measured in dollars. In the Army, the cost is measured in human lives. The Air Force core values are integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. Civil Service Code of Ethics put loyalty to the highest moral principles and to country above loyalty to persons, party, or government department. The FAR Standards of Conduct, Federal Acquisition Regulation. Government business shall be conducted in a manner above reproach and with complete impartiality and with preferential treatment for none. Transactions regarding the expenditure of public funds require the highest degree of public trust and an impeccable standard of conduct. The general rule is to avoid strictly any conflict or even the appearance of a conflict of interest in government-contractor relationships. And the Defense Industry Initiative signatories commit to act honestly in all business dealings with the U.S. government to protect taxpayer resources and provide high-quality products and services for the men and women of the U.S. Armed Forces. Okay, so given all of these codes of ethics, we should have no problems, right? All the codes say they want honor, honesty, fairness, integrity in one's belief and actions, but do they really? I would like to suggest that there are few institutions in the world that honestly, actually want you to reveal their wrongdoing. Almost none. For example, there used to be a program run through the DoD Inspector General where contractors could voluntarily disclose waste, fraud, and abuse that they had uncovered within their own shop. At first, there were about 40 disclosures a year, but quickly that hotline turned cold and trickled to almost no disclosures at all. Finally, at the request of the Justice Department, the regulations changed to becoming mandatory disclosures of waste, fraud, and abuse, no longer voluntary. And suddenly, in the last 3 years, there have been more than 600 disclosures. Institutions generally have to be pushed to do the right thing. So the question is not whether the institution will encourage you to do the right thing. The question is whether it will tolerate you doing it. I suspect that by this time you believe I am only seeing people engaging in waste and fraud around every corner. And I need to dissuade you of that. That could not be farther from the truth. I've spent nearly 25 years working around the military-industrial complex and have no trouble saying that some of the most honorable people I know are your colleagues. There are hundreds, maybe thousands, of extraordinary people I've worked with who have at great personal risk stepped forward and exposed corruption and other misconduct or supported their colleagues as they took that step, all from the military, public service, or contractor workforce. But I ask you, how is it that institutions filled perhaps almost entirely with people of high integrity end up engaged in questionable activities? Your world, the military-industrial complex, also has more money and personal power at stake than any other institution on the planet. As a result, there are nearly irresistible incentives constantly tempting people to succumb to human nature and make bad decisions. I think when ethics is taught, that it's often as a concept disconnected from real-life application. In the end, all the oversight and accountability mechanisms, the inspectors generals, the ethics codes, the codes of conduct, the fading posters hanging in government buildings, they're only as robust as the strength of that individual on the ground who stops and thinks about speaking up in the face of wrongdoing. Oversight, accountability, ethics, these grandiose concepts ultimately lead to a bottom line question. What does the person who encounters wrongdoing do about it? Do they keep walking, or do they care enough about these values and about the lives impacted by the failure to uphold them to take responsibility for honoring them? I have a sense that most people feel favorably towards the concept of government accountability and are glad somebody else is working on it, but don't really think about how it's accomplished. A little secret is that oversight and accountability is not a remote activity that's conducted by people with green eye shades in back rooms. Studies conducted by PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners both found that the majority of fraud findings were the results of tips from insiders or whistleblowers. In fact, whistleblowers were determined to have revealed misconduct more than twice as often as internal controls, such as audits. It's the person going about their day, minding their own business, who encounters an activity that makes them pause, that's the real standard bearer for accountability. No one plans on it, it just happens. So when you're faced with some sort of ethical dilemma, and I do believe it's when and not if, what will you do? Will you tell the truth? Will you support your subordinates when they try to do so? Accountability and oversight simply cannot exist without that truth-telling by the person on the ground who knows what's really going on, and that may be you or those under you. The responsibility to embrace truth-telling, whether by yourself or your subordinate, is a responsibility all of you bear, no matter what your title. But how you balance your personal success, how will you balance your personal success with the integrity of the institution and the values it's based on? Do you believe you're helping or hurting that institution by overlooking its failings? When does an ethical dilemma even rise to the level of being worth confronting? Of course, not all issues are equally significant, but what constitutes an issue worthy of blowing the whistle? Is the threshold question how much money is at stake, or how many lives are unnecessarily at risk? If it's only a few $1 million, or maybe just a handful of lives affected, or even just one, is it worth risking your career to stand up and say something? By the way, silence may be a safe harbor, but there's no room for Switzerland in the battle of right or wrong. By remaining silent, you're making a choice. I suspect, or I hope, that you've learned about Colonel John Boyd, the brilliant military strategist, and he was one of the great leaders of the Pentagon Underground. I had the great honor of knowing him and learning from this modern philosopher. So here's how he posed the question I'm asking. And he would have a big cigar, and so I can't pretend to be him. But one day, you will take a fork in the road, and you're going to have to make a decision about which direction you want to go in. If you go one way, you can be somebody. You'll have to make your compromises, turn your back on your friends, but you'll be a member of the club, get promoted, and get good assignments. Or you can go the other way. You can do something for your country and for your Air Force and for yourself. You may not get promoted, and you may not get good assignments, and you certainly will not be a favorite of your superiors. But you won't have to compromise yourself. In life, there's often a roll call, and that's when you have to make a decision, to be or to do. Sometimes the misconduct that occurs is just tax dollars improperly going into someone's pocket. Okay, that's an outrage, but maybe you wouldn't consider that worth tanking your career over. But sometimes misused funds leads to cutting corners, which in turn may mean counterfeit parts going into weapons, risking the success of both the mission and the lives of service people. For example, recently, the Senate Armed Services Committee just reported that counterfeit electronic parts installed on military equipment manufactured by Boeing, L3, and Raytheon are currently in use on aircraft flying missions in Afghan combat zones. In most cases, maybe hundreds of people are aware of the problem, but typically, only one person has the guts to say something. In the case of Abu Ghraib, it was young then specialist Joseph Darby who came forward to expose the systematic wrongdoing occurring at that prison. He turned photos over to the Army Criminal Investigation Division and was sitting in a mess hall in Iraq with 400 other soldiers when then Defense Secretary Rumsfeld named him on TV as the person who had exposed the misconduct by his peers. Yeah, can you imagine? Darby and his family met with death threats and had to go into protective custody, not because he had been the one committing the outrages, but because he had been the one to expose them. This brings me to another question. Is it actually dishonorable to dissent in the military? Is there a fundamental conflict between telling the truth and the command structure? Enlisted personnel take an oath to obey orders, and obviously that's clearly necessary for a functioning military. One might assume that we have, as a society, moved beyond the Nuremberg defense of following illegal orders, but is it always clear when just following orders is the wrong thing to do? Does the I've got your back commitment that is essential for people to be willing to risk their lives in combat extend to covering up for their wrongdoing? This was the central crisis in the 1976 West Point cheating scandal, when nearly half the junior class was expelled because they believed loyalty to one's classmate, including helping him cheat on a test and cover it up, trumped adherence to integrity. Just recently, I saw evidence of this mentality of unquestioning loyalty, even to a demonstrably craven policy, is still alive. You may be familiar with the terrible story of water contamination at Camp Lejeune, an environmental disaster that's believed to have caused many types of cancers in the Marines and their families based there, as well as increased miscarriages, birth defects, and deaths of the children born there. And as we were discussing earlier, of course, every military base has horrible toxins that are just because back in the early days people weren't aware of the dangers a lot of the solvents and other chemicals were being used. The problem, though, is that the Marine Corps shockingly covered up their knowledge of the contamination once they learned of it, meaning as many as 1 million people have been endangered. Documents reveal not only that the Marine Corps knew about the contaminations years before they acknowledged it, but also that a conscious decision was made not to let the victims know. There's a very moving documentary called Semper Fi, Always Faithful, that's out now. It's actually on Netflix right now. It was shortlisted for the Academy Awards. It follows one Marine's struggle to uncover the truth behind his beloved daughter's death. In one of our action alerts, we encourage people to watch the screening of the film on TV and push the Department of Navy to stop hiding behind Freedom of Information Act exemptions to withhold information from the victims. This information is necessary because many of the victims were in utero or born at Camp Lejeune and therefore don't have veterans' health benefits and have been forced to deal with significant medical expenses they've accrued on their own dime. Furthermore, informing the people who have cycled through Camp Lejeune about their possible contamination would help those who are not yet exhibiting symptoms to inform their doctors of particular cancer risks. But here's a response we got back to our action alert from one Marine. I spent 4 effing years, he didn't use effing, in the Marine Corps. I love the Marine Corps. You clearly were never in the Marine Corps. You don't put an effing poodle in a junkyard to guard it. You put in a mean mutt, and that gets the job done. That's the Marine Corps. You never criticize the Marine Corps. Mind you, this is his response to our trying to help the victims, who are Marines and their families. But incredibly, this man, actually someone challenged me, how do I know that was a man? I guess I don't know that, but I think that. Believed blind faith in the Marine Corps, even in the face of evidence that the institution was harming its own people, was more important than all the values articulated in the ethics codes we've reviewed. As the West Point Code says, the cost of dishonesty is measured in human lives. Tolerating a lack of integrity rips at the very fabric of trust necessary to ask people to risk their lives for their country. It's a betrayal of those individuals who rely on their superiors to use their power over them justly. This is what makes that Camp Lejeune story particularly painful. Those Marines could not believe the Corps would unnecessarily harm them, and it justifiably shook their faith when they learned that it had. That breach of trust may be more dangerous to the strength of commitment to military service than any enemy fire. Conversely, what happens if the responsibility for the misconduct lies within your chain of command? You need to be extra careful how you handle information coming up from below. How willing are you to allow your subordinates to blow the whistle on wrongdoing within your area of responsibility? Frankly, all of you in this audience are more likely to be in this particularly challenging position because of your seniority. A natural first instinct on learning bad news coming up through your ranks is to want it to go away, or not to listen to that annoying person that no one likes. Just because the person's annoying doesn't mean they're not right. Many years ago, I worked with a whistleblower at the Department of Interior who had repeatedly gone up his chain of command about a wasteful program. He documented billions of dollars of waste, and actually, ultimately, the Justice Department got a lot of it back. But several years later, that whistleblower's supervisor and I were having coffee, and he brought up the whistleblower and said, "I guess you're wondering how I could have let that happen all those years." And he confessed that he was blinded to the situation because the whistleblower was kind of a jerk. Only later did he realize that he was ignoring what the whistleblower was saying because of who he was. My point is not that whistleblowers are annoying. In fact, some of them are my very favorite people. But experience has taught most people that chances are they will be subject to the whack-a-mole treatment if they send bad news up the chain. Remember, people are only forced into being whistleblowers because they don't have faith that the traditional chain of command will honestly deal with the problem. So if you remember anything I'm saying, I want you to listen to these 2 sentences. As leaders, you will need to explicitly demonstrate that the messenger of bad news will not be punished under your watch. That instead, you will only punish those who engage in the misconduct, hide evidence of the misconduct, or retaliate against truth tellers. Let me give you some examples of people who didn't have the kind bosses that you will be, and already are, I'm sure. When Navy JAG lawyer Matthew Diaz internally raised his concerns that it was unconstitutional to hide the names of Guantanamo detainees, he met total resistance. He finally leaked the names to the Center for Constitutional Rights because his study of law taught him that our legal system was based on affording all prisoners due process. The Supreme Court later ruled that the administration must provide habeas corpus rights to Guantanamo detainees, but not until Diaz served 6 months in the brig and was dishonorably discharged. So Diaz was defending the Constitution and was even backed up by the Supreme Court. But the military justice system believed obeying the command structure was more important than the Constitution and the very ideals the military swears to defend. In another example, and I'm very happy to learn that you heard him speak last fall, 10-year Air Force and 12-year intelligence agency veteran Tom Drake was a contractor at the National Security Agency. He reported up his chain of command an out-of-control multi-billion-dollar program called Trailblazer that violated the 4th Amendment of the Constitution and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act because it was indiscriminately collecting electronic data from American citizens. Drake was not only outraged at these violations of law, but also that fully legal and significantly less expensive alternatives for improving national security were being ignored. After his chain of command ignored his concerns, he and a couple of colleagues went to Congress, which also ignored these disclosures. He reported his concerns to the Pentagon's Inspector General, which ultimately issued a classified report confirming his findings, but still nothing was done. Finally, out of desperation, he began working with a Baltimore Sun reporter, making only unclassified disclosures. For his efforts to protect the constitutional rights of American citizens, he was met with prosecution under the Espionage Act, the sixth such prosecution under the Obama administration. The Justice Department's case ultimately collapsed. The Trailblazer program was canceled, but only after extraordinary cost to the taxpayer and to Tom Drake and his family. And just yesterday, a spokesperson for the administration acknowledged that perhaps that prosecution was ill-considered. In another case, that of then 33-year Marine Corps veteran Franz Gale, when he was deployed in Iraq, he saw how IEDs were shredding Humvees and the troops inside them. He discovered that an urgent request for MRAPs had been sent from the field 2 years prior, but had been ignored by a complacent Pentagon bureaucracy. That's not my description. Even then Defense Secretary Gates said of the situation that nothing was happening. Gale also petitioned the Secretary of Defense's office and finally decided to come to Congress and show them the ignored request. He also went to the media. It was only because of a USA Today story that Gates himself stepped in and ordered the expedited procurement and delivery of MRAPs to the field. While this move was ultimately responsible for an estimated 40,000 lives saved, Gale did not receive a ticker tape parade. Instead, he was met with retaliatory investigations, loss of security clearance, and removal from duties. In the end, Gale was saved, and he is today back at work, but not because the system worked. He and his family paid the price for his not being willing to stand by and watch troops face unnecessary danger. It was because of outside organizations like POGO and the Government Accountability Project that had also been working with Tom Drake that we mounted a major public campaign on his behalf, and this hero is back at work at the Pentagon. There are laws on the books that are supposed to protect whistleblowers, but for the most part, they don't. We at POGO are actively working to create meaningful whistleblower protections for federal employees, especially in the intelligence field, military personnel, and contractor employees. Currently, protections exist on paper, but they're really not going to be very helpful to you. In fact, just this past January, the Ethics Resource Center reported that according to their 2011 National Business Ethics Survey, over a 2-year period, 45% of employees observed a violation of law or ethics standard at their place of employment. Reporting of this wrongdoing has gone up, but so has retaliation against employees who blew the whistle. More than 1 in 5 employees who reported misconduct experienced some form of retaliation and concern. You didn't sign up for this work expecting it to be easy. And most of you have already made profound sacrifices in serving your country. That call to serve, that call to defend principles is no small thing. You're separated from your families and friends for extended periods of time and are even risking your lives to defend our Constitution and country. You knew that going into this career. But you may not have realized that in addition to those extraordinary hardships, you may also be faced with choices that force you to take on a lonely battle that may distance you from your peers. So why do it? I've painted a picture of reality that's in nearly direct conflict with ethical principles. Will you allow those realities crush the idealism that drew you to serve your country? Or will you be inspired by the fundamental values behind the founding of our country? I don't want to suggest that you should figuratively run through the streets with your hair on fire to the New York Times or CNN. In fact, I will almost always argue against doing that. There are thoughtful ways of disclosing wrongdoing that can allow you to get the necessary policy changes made without your having to go public and suffer loss of job, isolation, divorce, even prosecution. Give me a call if you need advice someday. So why do it? When then Specialist Darby, the Abu Ghraib whistleblower, was interviewed on 60 Minutes, he stated, "Ignorance is bliss, they say, but to actually know what they're doing, you can't stand by and let that happen." When Anderson Cooper asked him if he would do it again, given what he and his family endured in the aftermath, he said, "Yes, they broke the law and they had to be punished." "And it's that simple?" asked Cooper. "It's that simple," Darby replied. I don't have any simple answers, no call to action that I'm asking you to take. I just want you to come away from this talk thinking about experiences you've already had. Did you place too much weight on personal or institutional preservation? And I ask that you contemplate whether, on reflection, you could have handled that situation better. And what will you do next time? When does one of those uncomfortable truths that everyone around you accepts without question rise to the level where you believe that institution, either the government, a contractor, your military service, has to be held accountable for wrongdoing, no matter what consequences you face? There isn't a formula here or a recipe that can instruct us. Just remember that in your world, the consequences for not doing something may be far greater. The unarmed battles fought by you here can determine the success or failure of the armed battles being fought elsewhere. Thank you all for your service and for asking me to spend time with you today. And I'd love to have you challenge me and tell me how I'm wrong. Well, yes.
Good morning, Mike Carrera, Seminar 7. I appreciate all the input and feedback you gave us about government waste, et cetera, and certainly there's a lot of valid points about that. But let's go over to Guantanamo Bay, one of my favorite subjects. I understand about the releasing and trying to make sure the rights of the detainees are protected, but one of the things that happened during this process, and I know you don't endorse what happened with WikiLeaks, but a lot of the names of the people that were serving down there were released, including the folks that were both the guards at the base and the folks that have been standing uniformed, and I think in some cases civilians, the trial counsels, et cetera. But my question is to you, understand U.S. citizens making sure those names are out there, but I'm trying to understand what the value added is of releasing Al-Qaeda, letting them know what the names of the detainees that aren't American citizens in Guantanamo Bay. How does that enhance our security, and how does that really enhance their rights?
So I'm glad you made the distinction, because I have tremendous anxiety over what happened with WikiLeaks, and in addition to service people, there were all kinds of people who are overseas who were helping. There were translators whose names, now they're in grave danger, so I have tremendous problem with what happened in that case. In the case of Guantanamo and what Matt Diaz did, where he did just list the names of the people who were being detained, to me, the matter, and for him the matter was that that's what our Constitution requires, that our court system requires, and the Supreme Court confirmed that. This is the way we have, as a society, a legal system. And it is uncomfortable, because I understand they're enemy combatants. But if we start cutting corners on the Constitution and making choices that the Constitution isn't convenient in this case, so we're going to ignore it, that's where we start to, I think, have sort of more of a downfall of our civilization when we're doing that. I think I was seeing something over there. Okay.
Hi, David Stone, U.S. Air Force. My question involves people who unilaterally decide to release classified information because they think the government is hiding behind the classification. And there have been some cases where, when it was released, it turned out that it didn't necessarily need to be classified. But that seems like a very slippery slope for somebody to say, well, I think this classification is hiding malfeasance or something wrong. But frankly, that's a judgment decision sometimes on one person's part. And I think that's a very dangerous precedent for anybody to start saying, well, I think this is wrong, so I'm going to declassify this and release it. Could you comment on that, please?
Yep, and you'll see I never said that people should release classified information. While we certainly challenge overclassification constantly, we have never been party to supporting someone releasing classified information publicly, directly to the press. When we have people who come with what is classified information, we believe that has to go through other types of channels. The problem is we don't have a meaningful way of dealing with it. So we go to the Congress, we have them give briefings in SCIFs, we respect the process. And sometimes that results in fixing the problem, but frankly, We have the reverse problem, which is when it is classified, there's very little that we can end up doing about it because we don't want to do what you said, not only because we're not qualified to determine whether something should be classified, but that person is really in grave risk when they're doing that. So I see the reverse problem to what you're raising, which is it's pretty rare for people to release classified information. But the problem is there is so much that's overclassified that is covering up, or just, it's out of rote that it's easier to classify than to, to justify something not being classified. And if anything, I think the problem is that we need to be working to change the system to make it more difficult to classify things. But we haven't, I'm sort of thinking back in our history, we haven't, there's one time, all right, here's one example of what we handled with what was a sort of a mosaic of what was then classified. We went to the National Security Council because it was a number of Department of Energy whistleblowers that were very concerned because at our weapons facilities here in the United States, the potential for plutonium being used to what was called an improvised nuclear device, even the term was classified at the time, so couldn't even talk about it. This is post 9/11, was more significant than the security considerations around those facilities had taken into account. So this is actually the possibility of detonating, not through the creation of an entire nuclear weapon, but just the plutonium could be turned into, by terrorists who are suicidal, getting into Los Alamos, for example, and in a relatively simple way, detonating the materials. And so what do? That's actually classified, but it was something of some consequence. And we were dealing with the Congress. We brought them to the Congress. The Congress didn't know what to do. And it was really an interesting situation. So then we went to the National Security Council and the Nuclear Command, NCC, or Nuclear Command Staff. Anyway, ultimately, they said, it was really fascinating. They told us just to start talking about it. And we did. We actually issued our report publicly in the Wall Street Journal, started reporting on it, and we were able to significantly improve the what's called the design basis threat, which is the standards of security at those facilities. But we had to go through, it was almost a year-long process of going through channels to try to get something to happen. So I guess in that case, we certainly weren't doing unilaterally, making a decision something shouldn't be classified, but it was very painful. And so I see sort of the flip side, which is when you're trying to fix a problem that's classified, it's nearly impossible. But I hear your point. I'm not comfortable with people just deciding something shouldn't be classified. Yes?
Good morning, Susan Arnold. I'm curious about your reasoning with the Matt Diaz case and the Supreme Court case that you cite. First of all, if you could tell us what Supreme Court case you're referring to, probably was Hamdan, but that Matt Diaz's court-martial was not considered by the Supreme Court, and the names that he released were in fact classified at the time that he didn't file a writ of habeas corpus for those detainees. He released the names to the media, and so his court-martial involved the release of classified information, and the very identity the government felt at that time was a sensitive matter. And I just would like your thoughts on that, and then also a lot of people, or some people, who have famously protested action, whether it's believing that President Obama is a citizen, whether it's the UN can have command and control over us, have publicly dissented from military ranks, believing in a heartfelt way that they have a constitutional basis for that. So where do you draw the line with the military discipline aspect of that sometimes you do, in fact, have to go along, or you don't do so at your own peril? Thank you.
I actually don't know the name of the court case, but we can look on Google maybe. My colleagues could look for it. And you're right, the case actually happened after he'd already been in the brig, and I think the timing was not, it was more the substance of the fact that his belief in the constitutional right in our justice system of those people having due process was upheld by or they had the same opinion that he did, I guess is a better way of articulating that. And he didn't go to the press, he went to the Center for Constitutional Rights because he thought they would be able to help offer them the legal services that he thought they should get under the Constitution. The sad part of what happened there is that the Center for Constitutional Rights turned that, he actually, I guess, put those names in a card, like a Valentine's card, and mailed it to them. And the center then turned that document over to the judge. And the judge then turned it over to the Navy, and it was really easy for them to figure out who it was that had sent the document, so he was immediately arrested. And so I'm a little confused, so I'd like you to explain a little bit more your question on the UN and people being able to dissent, because I want to.
Well, there have been a number of cases where military members have claimed that the military didn't have the authority to order them to do something. Just like in Matt Diaz's case, assuming, you know, I don't know if you know Matt, he was actually in my grad course class at the JAG school. Yeah. Assuming that he did in fact believe what you're saying, he believed that this was a constitutional matter. If a military member believes, you know, in the birther movement that President Obama isn't really qualified to be the president, or there was a Sergeant New who was court-martialed because he refused to wear a blue beret as part of his uniform because he believed that the Constitution said that he couldn't be part of that structure, that it was unconstitutional. So my question is, where do you draw the line and protect military discipline where people have heartfelt beliefs that may or may not be ultimately correct, but you can't have people just deciding for themselves?
I totally agree with this. That's what I'm saying. I don't have a simple answer. I mean, a really interesting one that's current is Lieutenant Colonel Danny Davis, who many of you are probably familiar with. He's come back after 4 tours and has written a lengthy article in the Armed Forces Journal saying he believes the military leadership is being deceptive in claiming more success in Afghanistan than is in fact true. And he's gone to the Congress, and I see this as a fascinating, like, what do you do when somebody who's a lieutenant colonel is saying that? Now, what's really fascinating is that at the moment, the Army appears to be letting him do this. There appears to be he's continuing to serve. He's working in the Army right now at the Pentagon. And they ask him when he makes these briefings to Congress that he do it on his own time. So that's sort of the question I have for you guys is, I don't know how you have a military command structure where people do have to obey orders. And at what point does an order rise to the level of this is something I shouldn't obey? I don't have an answer to that. I'm just raising the question because I think, you know, I stay up at night thinking about that. I don't know what the right answer is. I just think it's a question that's worth making you think about, because I think about it.
Ma'am, I'm Air Commodore Tahir Ranja from Pakistan Air Force. I've been actually pleasantly surprised, and it's been a very comfortable feeling when you see the American public, the services, and the country itself sort of owning up wrongdoings and then taking actions on those things. It has been very strengthening feeling. However, the last few, let's say, I would say months, there has been a lot of issues which point to the sort of moral sort of degradation of the army or the military. And while the things have become public and there are actions being taken, that's sort of a reactive sort of thing. So do you propose anything which should be proactive, and this sort of moral degradation should not occur itself? How should we go about that?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure exactly what. Tell me the nugget of the question.
Like, I would relate to the incidents happening in Afghanistan, where we have the YouTube videos coming out and like those things. So that's pointing towards the moral degradation of the individuals maybe, or the services maybe. So can we go do something which should be proactive and not let those things happen?
Not letting the releases of information or the use of social media?
No, the actions themselves.
The actual action.
Help me out. So you're saying the use of social media is helping to capture the actions that are improper, and what can we do to stop the actions in the first place?
No, he's talking about pissing on corpses and showing a flag.
How do we stop that from happening? Wow. I wish I were wise enough to know the answer to that. It's an incredibly important question. You know, what we just saw this week. I mean, it's horrifying to see it. I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that. But I'm glad those of you who are here studying are grappling those kinds of questions, because it's terribly important to figure out what are we doing, what is our system doing that's creating, I mean, those kinds of things in theory. I know we didn't have, YouTube and Facebook or Twitter in previous wars, but I don't think that we know of many examples of the kinds of things that we're seeing now happen in previous wars. So what's happening now that wasn't happening then? I don't know. It's a really important. Does anyone else have an answer to that? Because that's a really important question. I guess I don't feel so bad if you guys don't have an answer either. I don't know. Yes?
Rich Housen, U.S. Army. I want to say thank you for the role that you play in this as a professional military officer. It is hard for us, not because of necessarily personal failings, but because of our points of view professionally and the laws of bureaucracy and human nature to ask some of the questions you ask, and I thank you for it. I would like you to look at the sort of culture of those who do the sorts of things that you do. In our society, there's more than one NGO that does these sorts of things. I think we, as a group, are probably comfortable with the idea that someone will measure these issues, think about them, apply some of their own tests, and proceed in a measured way in the national interest. How do you judge the rest of the people that are involved with this type of work? Do you think most of them have the national good in mind when they are doing it? I suspect that there are some who enjoy playing gotcha and want to make a name for themselves doing it, and I think it's hard for us to judge that, but being a member of that particular cast, perhaps you can comment with some self-criticism.
Wow. I would honestly say that I don't think in the NGO world that I'm not aware of any of my colleagues that doesn't really have the greater good at heart. I would say that I think that the media has changed in my lifetime, where I think that truth isn't necessarily the goal of where they're reporting, and it's more, you sort of watch this sort of evolution of a television personality who used to be kind of thoughtful and smart, just become kind of way off on one side or the other just to get more ratings and not really be helping to elevate the conversation. So I would say if there's a part of my bigger world that I don't necessarily think is really focused on the national interest first, I would think it's some parts of the sort of the partisan media, and to some extent I'm not a big fan of the way that the political parties are operating too. I think they're more focused on getting votes and then moving the country forward. So I don't think the NGO, don't forget, our world is pretty, there's not a lot of glory in our world, and you're not making a big paycheck, so you have to have a reason to want to do it that's because you really care about something, more than just, anyway. That's sort of was that a cowardly answer? I mean, really, okay. I'm sort of going through all the alphabets of groups in my world, and there's no one who I don't respect as trying to do the right thing. I mean, we might disagree, but I think they're coming at it honestly.
Good morning, Anthony Hansen, United States Navy.
Good morning.
You made some comments regarding the efficacy of whistleblower laws and also the IG process, which were not very optimistic. And I was wondering if that was anecdotal or whether or not your organization has done any examination or has used any studies to indicate that these are systematically not working, or what percentage are, because having worked with people who are in that IG community, there is a lot of work being done to try to address misconduct.
Yes. So in the whistleblower world, actually the private sector whistleblower protections are not bad. They're, because of the financial crisis, there were laws that help whistleblowers in the financial sector or any of the publicly traded companies that are pretty strong. The world where you guys live, those laws, anecdotally at least, don't tend to work. Either if you're a defense contractor, you're better than if you're a contractor for any other service, like a State Department contractor. If you're a federal employee, they're really not good. If you're an intelligence agency employee, they don't even exist. And I guess the one useful study could say that the Merit Systems Protection Board, which is the body that handles federal employees' whistleblower protections, only about 1% of the cases were found in favor of the whistleblower, which is unlikely to, well, anyway, so that is what it is. And the military, especially the DoD-IG Military Reprisal Unit, that handles most of the military reprisal cases that come from up through the services, has had a lot of turmoil and a lot of concern about how that's been operating too. So I guess it's more anecdotal, but we have been working extensively with the IG community writ large, and we've issued 2 reports that we did surveys of all the IGs, the statutory IGs, not the military IGs. And there had been a lot of reforms actually that we helped to accomplish in the last couple of years to help to increase their independence, which helps with their ability to operate. They had generally not seen, and that was one of our biggest criticisms of them, working with whistleblowers as a central part of their mission. As it turns out, Gordon Hiddell, the recent DoD IG, very much thought it was an important part of their mission. And so that's probably the agency that most of you are most familiar with, and he actually was sort of setting the standard for the other federal agencies. The military service IGs, the problem for them is they're part of the command structure. I mean, I know when you talk to people in that world, they say, yes, but the Inspector General term was created by the military first, so it's ours. You can't take it over to the statutory side. It's complicated because they aren't actually able to be independent, and usually military IG is not even a full-time job. It's a partial job while you're doing something else, in a lot of cases, especially at the base level. So that is a process that we think needs a lot more thought as to how to have people in the military service have a more independent look that's outside the command structure of their, if there's a problem that they want to report up the chain. You're looking like your face is not happy. Tell me what.
I guess when I associate the term IG, it has been towards a higher headquarters level review, and that's allowed that independence as opposed to at the unit level. And that my experience has been that those are largely full-time jobs with staffs who have a mission to do this. Now,
that's true at the higher level there.
And so your comment that they are part-time and is inconsistent with my experience.
Got it. So it's the higher and lower level. Actually, I had the great pleasure of giving a talk like this to all of the senior managers at the Navy IG, down at the Naval Yard. And it started this fascinating debate between them, because I was raising this question about independence, and some of the senior people were sort of saying, of course, we're completely independent, no problem. And then some of the more junior people who were sort of further out in the field were saying, actually, there's no way I would say something that was going to make my command. And it was really a fabulous debate. It was really fun. So anyway. Yes.
Good morning, Andy Regan, Marine Corps. Got a question for you. Ultimately, we're large organizations are made up of individuals, and individuals are the ones who makes decisions. And taking the Camp Lejeune contaminated water case specifically, you said that there was a conscious decision by the Marine Corps, and you named the institution.
But not the people.
But not the people. Why not the people? I mean, I'd love to know who the hell it was.
I will, Greg Foster, who is my contact here, I will get him a scan of some of the documents and make sure he makes them available so you can see them. It's really awful. And there's language like, this would be a bombshell if anyone ever knew. I mean, it's just, and well, you know what? You'll see them if you watch the film, because they actually show them on the film too. And what's so awful is you see these men discovering these documents that they've had to fight so hard even to get, because the Navy keeps fighting back their ability to access them. So, but you're totally right. It's not the entire institution, it's individuals within the institution. That's a very good criticism.
But I guess I'd ask you, why wouldn't an independent outside organization just start naming people? Why is it that I gotta wait for probably a slanted film that has an agenda, okay, to go, oh, there he is, that son of a gun. You know, I don't,
I hadn't thought about it. You're right.
Why wouldn't you do that stuff? Because, I mean,
hadn't thought
again,
about-
when you name a large organization, it doesn't personalize it, doesn't do anything. And I think organizations would have more effect. I mean, you referenced the film Pentagon Wars, you know, again, a satire, so to say, but at the end of the day, Kelsey Grammer has the world fall down on top of his head in front of a large public audience, and it gives it some credibility that there was, okay, there's something went wrong there, and there's probably an individual behind it, vice the institution. And I also think it hurts institutions as whole if you start labeling them, and they are going to be defensive to organizations coming in and looking out.
No, you're totally right. No, that's a very good criticism, and if my colleague Angela in the office were here, she would know the name of the guy. I just don't happen. I mean, it's more than one person, but the authors of those memos. It's a good criticism.
Hi, Mike Berkeley from USAID. So I'm a civilian, and it's been an interesting experience to be here at ICAF because it's mostly, predominantly military.
Yeah,
and my question is,
jealous.
sometimes do you think we hold the military to an unrealistic ethical standard, where it's very easy for an outsider to say, you should do this, you should do that, but you're not having anyone shooting at you, and you don't have to make a split-second decision. So sometimes I wonder about that we ask military people to be, it's almost like police officers. If they shoot somebody and there's a gun pointed at them, we blame the police officer. And I think sometimes we hold them to unrealistic standards that we ourselves as just regular Americans don't hold ourselves to. So I just want to know what you think about that.
I think that's an excellent point, that as I'm talking about the sacrifices you've already made and are going to be continuing to make, those are profound. And that's why I concluded by saying I don't have simple answers, because I think those are really important questions. I deeply respect that you're willing to put yourself and your life on the line for these values. And it is a profound question that it's straight out of what's the Jack Nicholson movie? A Few Good Men.
Yeah,
right?
I could never handle the truth either, so it's
Right.
okay. Yeah.
But it's like, yeah, do you really want to know what I have to do to protect you? I think that's a really, where do you fall down on that side of the equation? I mean, it's a great question. So I think that's a good thing to be reminded of.
John Riedel Alvarez, Department of Navy, civilian. You've talked about the military. You've talked about some contractors. How about the congressional aspect? Any suggestions for?
Congress here, so I didn't waste my time on them. But go ahead. I could spend a lot of time on them.
Well, I'm just curious if there was 3 things you can change about how Congress or congressmen, congresswomen operate and hold themselves accountable as makers of law. What would those 3 things be?
Well, the first thing would be immediate online disclosure of campaign finance. It's ridiculous how they can still hide behind secrecy on that. That would be easy, and we do that day one. I think the thing that's worse now than it ever has been is this partisanship, where we actually give trainings every month to congressional staff on how to do oversight. And what we do is we insist, I always have a Democrat and a Republican as the trainers, and I say this is our nonpartisan zone, and neither party has the right answers, and no attacking each other. And I think that, I know that both parties, and this started a few years ago, made a conscious decision that their goal was to intentionally not let legislation that was from the other side get anywhere. And people who had previously worked together in a bipartisan way, members of Congress, would tell me, I used to be I loved working with my ranking colleague, but my leadership is telling me I can't anymore. And that, I think, is so venal and is part of, there's a whole gridlock is because of that the goal really is to just make the other side look bad so we can maintain the majority, so we can get more members, rather than there's some really important legislation that should be getting passed and no one's even paying attention to that anymore. So that's what I think would be, if I dealt with those 2 things, then I would be happy. I wouldn't even need a 3rd thing. Oh, yes, I would. I would want a more serious cooling off period before they left the Congress to be working for the private sector. And a better definition of, right now you can't be a lobbyist. So you could be Billy Tozan, who pushes the pharma bill through the Congress and go to work for Big Pharma, but not as a lobbyist. He's just an advisor making a lot of money for the industry that he helped get legislation passed, and staff can do the same thing. There was just, the Sunlight Foundation just came out with something like 400 staff in the last year have gone to become lobbyists. I mean, that's awful. So maybe that was 4 things, sorry. Are we good? Okay.
I actually have a question.
Oh, well, you got a big applause for it.
Step outside protocol here.
Okay.
Because there is an underlying subtext in the audience reaction here that relates to the relationship between the institutions that these folks represent and an organization such as yours. What can be done, what should be done to heighten the prospects that people such as us will see that organizations such as yours perform a useful function, and what can be done, what can we do to ensure that you are armed with the information that many here think you need to act responsibly?
I love the question, and I think the answer is to become more familiar with each other. I mean, I grew up in that Pentagon Underground world, so John Boyd and Jim Burton were my mentors. These are the people that I studied at the knee from the time I was 18. And I've sort of lost touch with the community of people who are inside this world, and to some extent there's the occasional person that we work with, but it's not, I don't go to Fort Myers Officers Club anymore. And just, the natural trust that can be gained from actually communicating with each other is incredibly important, and people can learn from us, or from me, or from my colleagues, that we really do just care about fixing things. We're not, our goal isn't to do anything other than that. And I think that do you guys have happy hours here? I think that having some sort of more informal communication or ongoing communication would be a really great thing, and I would welcome it. You can't imagine how much I would love that kind of interaction.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Bryan will be available after the session today if you have any additional questions in the Forrestal room. Also, please do not leave immediately after the session, because General Brown would like to address you. Ma'am, thank you so much for your time and your thoughtful comments. On behalf of ICAF, I have a small token to show our appreciation to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.